What's up? It's Rowan here from Artist Smart Education with the weekly HSC Echo Stats Update. In this episode, we're dialing into everything with the federal budget 25-26. In 15 slides, I'm going to give you the key things you need to know about this budget to include in your short answer and essays. So your first time dialing in these episodes, I summarize the key stats and headlines from around the domestic and global economy, giving you the key analysis you need to unlock a Band 6 in the HSC Economics course. So let's dive right in and unpack the key outcomes and measures from this latest budget. Now, note, I've gone through a 363-page budget strategy and outlook document to give you the key things that you need so you don't have to read it. So let's jump in and take a look. Now, the first thing that I think is important to note is we want to look at what the government is saying the forecasts for the major economic parameters, i.e. economic growth, real GDP, as we can see here, employment, unemployment, CPI, which is inflation, wage price index, and nominal. Now, the reason for this is that when we're evaluating the effectiveness of government policy, rather than sort of evaluating it to these general objectives, right, i.e. 3 to 4% economic growth, right, or 2 to 3% inflation, or, 4 to 5% unemployment, really what we should be doing is evaluating them on the basis of what the government is saying they think is going to happen as a result of their policy, right? So what we can see here is that the government is saying for 2024, 2025, but certainly for 25-26, which is where this budget is meant to be for, they're expecting 2.25% economic growth, right? They're expecting that the unemployment rate will remain relatively, unchanged. Tiny bit increase from 4% to 4.25%. They're expecting inflation to heat up a little bit. They're expecting it to come down from the 3.8 to 2.5%, right? But eventually to heat up a little bit to 3 as economic growth starts to grow, as we can see here in terms of that increase. And so what we want to do is, as we evaluate the policies this budget puts forward, we want to ask ourselves, okay, what are the likelihood that this budget will create these economic outcomes? Because that's how we want to evaluate the policy in terms of whether or not it's going to be effective or not. So with that in mind, let's go look at the major sort of initiatives that this budget has highlighted. Now, one of the things we can first do before we even dive in is you can get a sense of the budget's priorities and the government's priorities just by looking at their documentation. And this here is their budget overview document. And we can see here the contents page. And you might be thinking, contents page? Why are we looking at contents page? But it tells us some interesting things, right? We can sort of see, okay, primarily the first thing they're hitting there is the cost of living. So really what they're trying to look at is great, it's an election year. How do we tackle the cost of living? But underneath a lot of that, right, if we take a look, the cost of living tax cuts, right, energy bill relief, growing wages, cost of medicines, cutting student debt, right, a lot of that is also really targeted for lower income, middle income earners. It's also about not only, improving cost of living, but in many ways also dealing with income inequality in the economy. And you can sort of see, therefore, as a Labor government, they're going to have slightly different focuses on policy and economic objective than, different governments, liberal or otherwise. And then you've got strengthening Medicare as the next thing, which again is access. It's about access to healthcare, which tends to again have a broader impact on lower income, middle income earners, right? Making it easier to buy and rent a home, investing in every stage of education. So we can sort of see some of the broad areas that they're focusing more on. And it's only when we get, to the back end of this that we get to building a stronger economy, okay? And I think that is quite telling when we evaluate this budget as well. So let's dive in. Now, one of the big things we want to look at here is the overall budget outcomes, right? We've got the underlying cash balance here, okay? And it's important to note that what we're looking at here is the outcome, not the stance, okay? The outcome is, revenue less expenditure. Is it a surplus or a deficit? Where stance is the impact it's likely going to have on economic activity. So we can see that we had, a surplus budget, 23-24. The expectation for the 24-25 budget, so this current financial year that we're in, the budget that was released last year, is that that'll be a decent deficit, 27.6 billion. So we can see that that has been expansionary, okay? And you'd argue that it's probably moved slightly past now mildly expansionary because, that turnaround is, close to 45 billion, right? Now, what about the 25-26, which is what this budget is for? Well, that's forecasting a $42 billion deficit, okay? Now, note, that's not a significant change from their expectation of 27.6. That's what, maybe 15 billion. So I think you would argue here that it's very mildly expansionary in its likely impact on economic activity. Now, of course, the reason that's important is the government is quite concerned and is mindful about increasing inflationary pressures in the economy through an over-expansionary budget. But at the same time, they've got a quite tightrope they need to walk because inflation is very, very low. Economic growth, we've had, basically up until the December quarter, we had, I think, 8 consecutive quarters of GDP per capita recessions, right? So they've got this challenge where they need to, as a macroeconomic policy mix alongside monetary policy, put some more energy into the economy, right? Grow aggregate demand. But they can't do it too much because it risks inflationary pressure and the cash rate staying higher for longer, which is obviously hurting lots of families and impacting on cost of living. So, the compromise here is let's make it mildly expansionary. We need to do a little more here, but let's not go too hard. Now, a couple of other things to note here. We've also got gross debt and net debt as a percentage of GDP. And so you can see, first of all, I should highlight alongside looking at net debt, we can see that there is really, future deficits planned. And they're not really getting all that small. They're all sitting pretty, at the moment, based on this estimate, right, sitting in the 35 to 30, sort of $7 billion deficit. So decently significant. Now, we can see that the result of that is it's going to take our net debt as a percentage of GDP up, right? It's going to grow it from 19.9 to 23.1%. Now, note, that's something that we've got to be mindful of, and maybe some of the criticism that we can raise about this budget is that, okay, it's forecasting, future deficits in sight, no surplus in sight, and yet the question is it really doing anything structural in this budget? So, i.e., are any of the policies designed to try to deal with some of the structural issues the Australian economy is experiencing? Namely, one of those is low labour productivity, which is impacting our ability to drive economic growth, which is in turn impacting as well, future receipt of, government revenue, partly because we've also got aging population. So there's a couple of things going on here, and I'll certainly do my best to unpack some of that in a little more detail. So let's keep going through. So what's one of the big things that they've announced? So one of the big things is new tax cuts for every Australian taxpayer, and this has been a real interesting one. It's an election year, so your sort of analysis you can layer on here is obviously the political cycle. We've got an election coming up. There's a little bit here of like, great, let's give something back to everyone, and sort of like a vote buying. But the reality is that this won't kick in until 2027, okay? 2026, I should say, okay? So that will kick in, not in this budget year actually, but in the year after. And then it'll see a further reduction in 2027. So this is for low-income earners ultimately, right? So it's for the taxable, the marginal tax rate, is for the bracket between 18,000 and 45,000. Okay, that's going to be 16% right now. It's going to come down to 15% as it highlights, and then it'll go down to 14. So you can see this is also designed to, support low-income earners in a cost of living crisis, but also deal with income inequality, which is one of the big focuses a Labor government tends to have. Now, they do highlight this is pretty modest. It's, modest cost of living relief, modest, sort of attempts to deal with bracket creep. What does this actually mean? Well, an average worker earning $79,000 gets a tax cut of $268 in 27, I should say. So, you're not getting a lot. And $536 per year, the year after, when that, sort of tax goes down to 14%, okay? So, generally speaking, what they're saying is it's about $50 a week by the time, you're in 2027, 2028. And so we can sort of see that here as well, okay, in terms of what these tax cuts are going to look like. Now, note, why are they delaying this? Well, they're delaying it because, it's one of these things where they can sort of make the announcement, right? Tax cut coming, sort of get hopefully some of the benefit from an election perspective coming up, but then on the flip side, not push it through this year because it doesn't, they don't want to impact inflation, right? So there's that tension they're trying to navigate, right? How do we stimulate a bit of economic growth? How do we deal with cost of living but not deal with inflationary pressure? And so the way that we do that is we delay this by a year in terms of its first implementation, 26, 27, and then 27, 28, okay, is where it goes down a further percent. So, the criticism here, and certainly Dutton, in terms of, the opposition raised it, it's like, really, like, is this meaningful to anyone, right? Like, is this going to have that much of an impact? Surely there's going to be more effective ways that we could be thinking either about, if it's tax cuts, but alternatively other areas that could be invested in the economy. And so, I think, great, it's coming in the future. We'll deal with income inequality and certainly improve it for lower income earners. Very small amount, to what extent is it going to have any meaningful impact? And certainly by the time we get to 26, 27, as well, depending on the further cost of living crisis and inflationary pressure that's occurred between now and then. So, again, there's more, though, that is focusing. You'll see that a lot of this budget is really focused on trying to deal with cost of living. The argument and the criticism here is a lot of it's all very small stuff, that whether or not it makes a significant contribution to cost of living is questionable. So they're also going to extend, an extra $1.8 billion to extend the energy bill relief, So they've already been providing energy bill relief, and we can see that here. And they're saying over 10 million households and 1 million eligible small businesses will receive 2 additional quarterly $75 rebates, right? Extending support. So in other words, it's an extra $150, right? Again, such a small sort of drop in the ocean, okay? Now, it has had an impact in reducing, the prices of energy, which I think have been fantastic, and they have highlighted here that it did directly reduce inflation by 0.6% of a percentage point in the December quarter. So, this shouldn't be sneezed at in terms of its impact on inflationary pressure and the macroeconomic policy mix with monetary policy and getting inflation down. But on the flip side, to what extent is it making a significant dent with cost of living? Again, for low-income earners, certainly yes, but for middle income and above, it's pretty, drop in the ocean. What else are they doing? Well, they've got cheaper medicines. Again, we're seeing this theme come through, right? So this is where they're trying to, basically decrease the co-payment, increase the amount they're putting in on medications on the pharmaceutical benefit scheme. So they're making it cheaper from $31.60 to $25. So that's, you've got a medication you need to buy, it might be really expensive. The PBS funds a lot of it, but they request a co-payment from you as an individual. And so they're making that cheaper, the amount that you need to pay. Now, once again, it's expected it'll save $200 million of out-of-pocket costs. Who does this make, the most impact for? Like it's, a $6.60 difference. So again, you can see this is really about cheaper medicines, making, medicine more accessible really for low-income earners. So again, great initiatives, right, in terms of opening up access, but we can sort of see that a lot of these signature policies at the moment are really targeting lower income earners and, cost of living. Now, they're also expanding bulk billing, and this has been, I think, a real critical area, where, doctors are sort of had to increasingly over the country due to insurance costs and other expenses, had to, step away from bulk billing. Now, that is essentially where when, you turn up, you don't have to make a payment to your doctor. You can see a doctor for free because then Medicare will cover the cost of you seeing that doctor for that, that GP for that treatment. A lot of doctors have had to introduce, basically payments, right, where it costs for you to see a GP. And so the idea here is for the $8.5 billion over 5 years to provide more incentives to increase more bulk billing. And so in some ways, this is about like subsidizing, right? It's subsidizing, medical practices and GPs that have felt the need to introduce payments to hopefully encourage them to reduce those payments entirely. So there's no payment or the amount that they're charging falls, okay? And so they're claiming at least that there's expected to result in 9 out of 10 GP visits being bulk billed and additional 18 million services being bulk billed each year. Now, I'm a little skeptical about this. Hopefully that's the case. 9 in 10 is a real big, sort of statement to be making here. I mean, look, they are investing $8.5 billion. It is a decent chunk of money over 5 years. And so the hope is that we'll achieve that. But, it's a big call to be sort of saying. Now, one of the big challenges has been obviously housing in Australia. Affordability, certainly, for young people particularly as well. And so one of the big areas that they're continuing to make investments is in housing. They're supporting 55,000 social and affordable homes over the next 5 years through initiatives like their Housing Future Fund, which has already been set up, and the Social Housing Accelerator already set out, okay? They've additionally committed $1.5 billion through the Housing Support Program to, state, territory, local governments to also try to fund projects to improve planning capability, better infrastructure. Because obviously, if we're building more houses, in higher density living, it's going to create stresses on infrastructure as well. Alongside this, they're also placing a ban on foreign buyers of established homes. The idea here is that foreign buyers coming in to buy new builds actually supports, fund new building development and, is a positive actually in enabling new home creation. But when it's competing on established homes, the argument is that it can, reduce supply, drive up cost. And so they're placing a ban here on that for a 2-year period. So we've got our housing. Now, the thing to think about with housing is, again, okay, will this really move the needle? I mean, 55,000, social and affordable homes is great, right? But is it going to do enough, right? Is the real question. Is it going to really shift house prices? The answer is probably no, to be really frank. Again, it will for, sort of class of, people in the economy, right? Low socioeconomic, right, who, are struggling, as it says, social and affordable homes. But more broadly, will it have a significant impact on the overall prices of homes? No. And so, again, one of the criticisms here is there's, a fair bit of policy, but it's almost like, little paper cuts to the issue, right? Is it going to actually deal with the issue and make a huge impact? It's arguable. Now, what they are doing is they are making significant investments in education. And again, these are all very common sort of areas that Labor invest in. Okay, like income inequality, health, right, education. These are all areas, and we can see that. So, one, for those at university, it's going to reduce student debts by 20%, $16 billion in debt. And again, this is also about looking at, the theme here is not just about low income, it's also about young people, because young people are typically lower income simply because they're young, they don't have experience, they're early in their careers, they're going to be earning less. So it's also a budget that is trying to address some of these issues, although, as I've highlighted, little paper cuts to something that needs something much stronger, perhaps. Now, ultimately, though, they're going to wipe some debt, which is fantastic. They're making free TAFE permanent as well, as part of skilling and training a workforce to meet the future needs, and that's very much part of a labour market policy as well, to really improve, our sort of, human capital. And so their argument here is that, over the next decade, 9 out of 10 new jobs will require post-secondary qualifications, and almost half will come through the VET pathways. Now, of course, that includes, work, whether or not that's in the construction and housing and building industries as well, which we've obviously got major shortages for. So they have introduced legislation to make 100,000 free TAFE places permanent every year from January 2027. So I think that's, just a good example of some serious investment into education in Australia. Now, alongside this, they are funding some wage increases for aged care and childcare workers. There's obviously been a lot of, some damning reports about aged care and treatment of our elderly and an aging population. This is obviously a growing issue for Australia. And so they are making investments to provide pay increases to aged care nurses. Okay. Saying, and their statement is this will take, that's 2.6 billion, it'll take the total increase in wages to 17.7 billion, and also investing 3.6 billion to support wage increases for early childhood. So sort of either end of the spectrum here as well. Now, a big part of what they're trying to do, and this is arguably where they're trying to deal with a little bit of the fact that we've had lower productivity, right, is they've, highlighted some attempts to sort of really try to revive our national competition policy, which is something that you'll look at more in microeconomic form. But ultimately, one of the things they've highlighted is banning non-competes for low and middle income workers. These are sort of non-competes that restrict someone moving from one job to the other in the same industry. Often it's exactly that, movement between one firm to the other that enables pay increases to occur. And so if you restrict that, it can place downward pressure on pay, which is the argument that they're making from their competition review that they found. So, what is telling about this budget, which is quite interesting, is that usually Labor has quite a strong focus on the environment, but this budget was very thin on environmental policy. So number one, they have, 262 million over 5 years, which is really not very much, right? It's maybe 50 million-ish, a little bit over 50 million a year, right? To meet its 30 by 30 commitment of conserving 30% of Australia's landmass and 30% of Australia's marine areas by 2030. Now, to be frank, this is almost the first time I've heard of this commitment, right? Which says something as well about, just the government's focus on this as an issue. Certainly it's, taken a very big back seat. The other thing that they've highlighted is, a 2 billion green aluminium product credit from 28 to 29 as part of their Australia's, Future Made in Australia policy, which is already in place, and this is just an extension to it, which will help aluminium smelters transition to renewable electricity and decarbonise. So it's important to note that, it's not, they do have policies from the prior, budgets that do touch upon environment, but it is telling that there is such a small focus in this budget. Now, they do have some investment going into infrastructure, 17.1 billion over 10 years, okay, for new and existing road and rail projects, right? 2 billion to upgrade Sunshine Station, 1 billion for a road blitz with the Victorian government, $1 billion for the Southwest Sydney rail extension. So they are making infrastructure investments, and that is part of, again, supporting employment in the Australian economy. Note that a lot of the, low unemployment rate that we've seen has not been driven by private demand for labour, but it's coming from the public sector. And so deficits like this, right, we've already had one in expected $27 billion deficit. This is 42. Remember, these place demand for labour, right, and ultimately do drive down our unemployment rate. So there's a positive there. Of course, we'd really want to see, and the criticism is, to see that demand for labour being driven more by the private sector. And this budget is very light. I mean, hopefully you can sort of see that at the moment there's very little in here that is, looking at how do you get the private sector really ticking, because that's the more sustainable long-term pathway to growing the economy, rather than relying on, increasingly, bigger or at least, large government deficits, which is what we've seen. So that's, again, like an underlying criticism that you could really raise of this budget. Now, ultimately, okay, like that's sort of like the overall core, right, in terms of like some of the key spending initiatives. And so we can see that there really is not that much coming along here, okay, when we look at broadly, how do we deal with some of the structural issues in the economy? And so a really great piece of analysis here, just to wrap up, is from Ken Henry, he's the former Treasurer Secretary. And one of the things that he's highlighted is that, it's very clear that this budget, and both sides, I haven't looked at the, the Liberal sort of opposition response budget, but ultimately what we can see is that this budget is very focused on like election, right, pandering to the electorate, right, which is what he highlights here. And I think one of the things that he's highlighted is that pre-COVID, it was this idea that Australia we were doing pretty well, okay? We had great tailwinds of strong demand for our commodities, right? Terms of trade doing incredibly. We managed to avoid a recession, okay? All these amazing things, right? But ultimately what's happened, right, is that, we've got a situation that even though we've got a strong mining sector, we've had decades of business investment at levels previously recorded only in deep recessions. And the challenge in Australia is that the way that we get improved labour productivity, which is how we get sustainable wage growth, right, which is really critical to improving living conditions over the long term, it's typically been through, multi-factor productivity growth through investment in capital, which is this idea of capital deepening, right? Where we're essentially giving for, each, per unit of labor, more capital, right? Infrastructure, tooling, machinery, etc., to improve their ability to be productive. And unfortunately, we've seen very little business investment. Certainly the levels we've seen, as Ken Henry highlights here, have been only recorded in deep recessions. Now, alongside that, okay, we've got a tax system that also makes it very difficult, okay, for young people to essentially buy a home, okay. And part of this, I think, is we've got an aging population, so we've got increasingly, okay, more and more people are going to be retiring, so we're going to have less people younger having to support them, okay? And so the argument here in the Intergenerational Report, first published in 2002, was that the way that we lift the real rate of GDP per capita, okay, right, is that ultimately we need to lift it by sort of 1% at the time, okay? And the way that we do that is through probably, reconsidering tax and really getting a stronger productivity growth. Okay, that was really where they were sort of highlighting, is that we're going to get stronger productivity growth, we're going to see increases in real wages, right? And that's going to be a sort of, the key way that we can do this. Now, ultimately, that hasn't happened, okay? Ultimately, like the criticism here is that, like we've got policies in place that really encourage investment into, capital gains vehicles, i.e. property, where you put investment and you get a capital gain, great, rather than necessarily into investments that encourage increases in productivity. And so, Ken's policy here is that, there needs to be courage to fix, the tax system, to, basically foster high rates of capital investment, remove tax distortions that favour investments in capital gains over investments that support productivity and real wage growth. And I think we can argue that looking at this budget, it deals with none of those structural issues. Now, perhaps the argument that Labor have here is that politically, well, we'll put a nice looking budget up, right? We'll get re-elected, and then once we've got re-elected, we've got a mandate to do some of this. But the truth is, it's very likely it'll be a hung parliament, right? That minority parties will have a play in forming some form of, working coalition for, government. And so the reality of then maybe making some of those changes will become even harder. So there's going to be less clear of a mandate, if anything. So there's plenty of analysis. Hopefully that helps you think through this budget and think through some of the sort of limitations that you can start to use. In future episodes, I'll dive in to some more analysis that comes out on the budget. So you've got more of this that you can use for those topic 3 and topic 4 essays. Additionally, we'll look at the macro policy mix in how this budget sits alongside monetary policy as well. If you have any questions, leave it in the comments below. Otherwise, I'll see you next week.